So hi everybody. If you feel comfortable to turn your video on, I much prefer talking to actual people's faces than to just names, but I know some people feel uncomfortable about that, so no pressure either way. But let's see. She was saying, yeah, so I've actually been with Classical Academic Press since its inception. I was one of the original founders of the company, but I'm not an owner anymore. I have been an author for them. I authored or co-authored The Art of Argument and The Discovery of Deduction, to the two logic books that CAP produces, and have stayed in great working relationship with the press for a long, long time now. In 2014, I want to say, Chris Perrin invited me to try just launching an online school, which we call Scholé Academy. We started that year with 2 kids in my logic classes and 2 kids in a couple of other classes. I think Argument Builder was one of them. I think we started with like 4 kids total, and that was in 2014. It was just a beta year just to kind of see how things were going to work out. And right now, as we are getting ready to launch the next school year, we have over 1,700 enrollments, which is just crazy cakes to me that things have grown that quickly over the last little while. So as the director for Scholé Academy over the last few years, we've been taking things online, all of our, as many classes as we can. We've got logic, math, science, writing, grammar, languages, Latin included, of course. But anyway, so Scholé Academy is thriving as well. But I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about logic, and a little bit about how I approached teaching logic, some of the tips and tricks that I use, even some of the making some determinations about who's ready and maybe who might not be ready for teaching logic. For some of you, I just did a logic webinar last week, and I think I'm going to be coming at this a little bit differently than I did last week, but there's probably some overlap, so I apologize if it's not all fresh information. But so anyway, so I guess I'll start by saying, just kind of quickly, like how I start planning for a class. And what I usually do is, in any of the cases, whether it's the Art of Argument or the Discovery of Deduction or Everyday Debate or Argument Builder, I always start from the end goal and then I work backwards, which is a pretty common practice, right? If you want to know what you need to do in kindergarten, if you're going to have a K-12 school, it's probably a good idea to start with, well, what kind of graduate do you want to end up having, right? What does your graduating senior look like? And then kind of work your way back from there. So if you know that you want your graduating senior to have X skills and character traits and qualities and things, and say, you kind of work back, well, what do they need to do in 11th grade to prepare them to take the 12th grade class that produces that? And then what do you need to do in 10th grade to prepare them for 11th and so forth. And I use basically the same philosophy about teaching logic. So I know that in the end of logic is not just an ends to itself. It's a means to something, and usually it's a means to two different paths. One is a mathematical path, which I think what the world kind of typically thinks that is, if you're a logical person, that you're just sort of mathematically oriented, right? And you're going to be a computer programmer, coder, web developer or something, right? And there's nothing wrong with thinking that is a outcome of where logic can lead. But in the classical circles, I usually think in terms of rhetoric as being the destination, of being a really good writer, being able to write with wisdom and eloquence, as both in high school and beyond. And so I think in terms of what do I need to do in the logic classes to get kids to the point where they can either push through into a more propositional based kind of logic that might push them towards that more analytical side, a mathematical side in the that programming maybe as the destination. And how do I need to position them so that they're ready to really take full account and appreciation of what Aristotle describes in his rhetoric. So if I had time on my hands, and I know not teachers, I mean, that's not something that happens to us. But if I had time on my hands, and over the years I have made time to kind of do this, it's almost like working both ends towards the middle. So I've always looked at, okay, what do I need to be able to teach for next year, right? And so I'm making sure that if I'm teaching the art of argument for next year, yes, I have to read that textbook. I need to know how to teach that, know that curriculum. I've got to do that. But then I'm also going to pick up something that would be on my destination spectrum, and that's going to be in rhetoric, right? And then I'm going to every year make sure that I'm kind of working my way to the middle, like so that I can ultimately get to a point where I bridge the gap, and I have then given myself the entire spectrum of logic to rhetoric. And so if you've if you're going to be teaching the art of argument as a to seventh graders, then I would study the art of argument, make sure you know that curriculum inside and out. But I would also probably pick up a copy of of Aristotle's The Rhetoric. And this is a book by, it's an edited version by Edward P.J. Corbett. And there's two books in here. It's Aristotle's Rhetoric and his Poetics. And I would read through, if the idea here is that you would want students to be prepared to engage with Aristotle's rhetoric at some point, then you might want to read through what his primary source is. Now, there are other books that would probably, if you feel like, I don't know if I'm quite ready to read Aristotle, like the primary source yet, that's intimidating to me. And, that was intimidating to me at a point as well. You might want to start with maybe picking up a copy of Rhetoric Alive, the first book there. That would be the press's student book, and you can pick up the teacher book if you wanted to. But that's basically taking and saying, okay, so how do you do Aristotle's rhetoric and as Rhetoric Alive? Or there's another book, which I had at the office. We're kind of in that awkward spot where COVID has forced us home again. So like half of my resources are on my bookshelf at my office and the other half are here. I'm sorry about that. Another book that Edward Corbett has also edited is called Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. That's like basically a college level rhetoric text, but it basically goes through rhetoric, and that's probably that would be a good resource to maybe read through as somebody who's trying to educate themselves on what does that, if you're aiming towards rhetoric, that's a good adult level book to read through. And then from there, you'll even see that in Edward Corbett's Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student and in Rhetoric Alive, that there are quotations and passages taken right out of Aristotle's rhetoric. And then that can kind of, make you feel like, okay, if I pick this up maybe the following year, I kind of know where I am. I recognize some of the landscape. It's not completely foreign. I've read actually some excerpts from Aristotle. So reading one of those two textbooks, one at a high school level, one at a college level, might be a good and a better introduction to get you to all the way to reading a primary source if that gap or that jump is too much. But that's what I would probably do, is sort of consider the rhetoric book sort of professional development reading, right? And then I would make sure that I was really ready to actually teach the art of argument to seventh graders. So I would kind of do both of those two things, maybe simultaneously. And then the following year, I'd make sure, every time you teach a class for the first time, of course, you always want to go back. When you're teaching it for the second time, you're kind of like, okay, now I know where all the pitfalls are. I know what I'm not going to do again. I know what I wished I would have done more of, right? And so you won't probably want to take that second year to kind of go back through the art of argument again as like a form of study over the summer. But maybe now you want to add in another, like the next level piece in from the rhetoric end. So if that means reading Aristotle as a primary source for that summer, that might be a good thing. If that means picking up something like the argument builder, where did I put that? Here it is. The argument builder, which is going to be like a step. We call it, I usually refer to a book like this almost like a pre-rhetoric class. Basically takes the process of invention and the common topics of rhetoric, which all that language would make sense to you once you've studied rhetoric. And it kind of, it's a good, gives you some practical exercises for how to go through that process of invention in rhetoric, almost like a pre-rhetoric text. And so maybe you would do those two things for that second year. And then the third year, you probably feel like, okay, now I know what I'm really doing in art of argument. I don't necessarily need to revamp that course, maybe refine, tweak little things, you know, here and there. You can always do something, but maybe that third summer, maybe instead of really digging into the art of argument, maybe you tackle something like the discovery of deduction. And I'll talk about this book a little bit more in just a minute, because this is the science side of logic. We talk about logic being both the art and the science of reasoning, and it's really one thing. But for the purposes of our CAP textbooks, we've split the two sides of logic into its two separate courses, so that the art of argument is focusing on the artistic, informal, inductive side, and this discovery of deduction is focusing on the formal, deductive side of logic, with the idea that you really need both of them to fully appreciate what is logic. And so the art of argument and the discovery of deduction together really forms an introductory logic course. To just do one or the other of them is to just say that logic is the art of reason, or logic is the science of reason. And logic is both the art and the science of reason. So we need to, it's important that you as an instructor understand that if you're teaching just one of those two classes, that part of what you need to be doing is to remind your students that the other half is required, and that ultimately they need to operate knowing with that both sides of that coin, that coin needs to be completed. So anyway, so for that third summer, you might pick up maybe the discovery of deduction, and then maybe you might pick up something, you know, something else, let's see, maybe something like everyday debate. But if you're really looking to kind of dig into Socratic logic and deductive logic, we could even point you to something like Socratic Logic by Peter Kraft, or this one is Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking by Ryan Byerly, which is another great book. Both Socratic Logic and Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking are college level texts. This one I really like a lot. I was just introduced to it recently. It really does get into the formal side of logic. So I mean, it's going to be a deeper dive on the formal side, just like the Socratic logic is going to be a deeper dive on the formal side of logic. But there's also this notion of that there is a truth, and that virtue is a significant component of exploring and knowing what truth is. And so I've really liked the fact that this book, how Byerly really puts together logic within the construct of an absolute truth, and that there is a virtue development component to the not only the pursuit of truth, but then the use and the employment of logic. So this is actually, I'm really appreciating this book, but this is definitely going to be a deep dive into formal logic for sure. Again, these books would be college level texts. So these would be for you and your professional development. These would be for you to build out a little bit larger foundation for yourself if you were going to be teaching a book like The Discovery of Deduction to students. I like to encourage instructors whenever I can, please, you know, again, your first year, everybody gets a mulligan, right? You're just keeping your head above water. You're going to survive. That's the big goal for the year. But then after that, anytime if you're going to teach the discovery of deduction after that, it's really important that this not be your primary source of your professional development and logic. Your foundation needs to be wider and deeper than what your students have. So if you're going, because the kids, they will ask you questions that sort of require that you've done some thinking outside of this textbook about some of these questions. And if you've limited your professional development to, I know this one piece of curriculum, you're not going to be able to field questions, and you're going to feel probably a sense of insecurity about venturing too far off on rabbit trails, right? Because you're going to quickly feel like I am out of my depth, right? If we don't stick to questions that I prepared for, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to field any kind of questions that come at me. And so that limits your confidence, it limits the ability to have really good Socratic discussions, it limits the student's ability to really challenge and explore thinking, because you're going to feel like, I don't know how to answer your questions, and that's just going to keep everybody a little bit more insecure about where you can go in the class. So if you're going to be teaching something like the discovery of deduction, I would encourage you to pick up a book like one of these two at some point. Again, not the year you're keeping your head above water, but at some point to continue your professional development, to make sure that you have given yourself a good, solid foundation, and you feel like you could really, you could handle a question that the kids asked you without feeling, insecure about it. So that's my first idea, is to really think of it as, where do you want the kids to go? Where do you, how do you want them to, what do you want a student who's taken logic to be prepared for? And then as you're thinking about your curriculum, you have to think in terms of your own professional development as well, so that you can make sure that you are pointing them in the right direction. A lot of teachers, or sometimes teachers can forget that when Aristotle talks about rhetoric and being prepared to write well, he's not, let me say what he is doing. He is assuming that students will have had logic to prepare them to write well. And a lot of teachers mistakenly assume that, oh, well, he must be referring to the artistic side of logic, right? The linguistic side. It must be that kids need to have had the art of argument, so we can forget about the discovery of deduction, because that's harder and it's not as fun, it's the formal side of logic. And then they'll be ready for rhetoric. But we have to remember that there was no such thing as like common fallacies that we talk about at that time. At the time, when Aristotle is assuming that his students have had logic, he's assuming that his students have had deductive logic, that they understand what a syllogism is. And so if you decide to skip over formal logic, thinking, skip over formal logic, thinking that that's not necessary in order to be a good writer, you're actually taking the entire core out of what Aristotle considers to be a rhetoric program. He's building off of a deductive platform of understanding what logic is. He's not building off of what ad hominem abusive arguments are when he's encouraging students, or when he's encouraging his students and thinking about how to be a good orator. He's talking about, can you construct a valid argument at the core of any writing that you do? And that's a syllogism. And I mentioned this in the seminar I did a couple of weeks ago. When a student comes up with what his or her thesis statement is, that's really the conclusion to a syllogism. There needs to be a valid argument that's constructed validly, right? That takes two premises and yields a true conclusion. We want two true premises and a true conclusion, and we need that argument to be constructed in a way that is valid. And that should be the sort of the internal core, the nucleus of a good outline. And so when students are building out from there, they want to be constructing a series of syllogisms that have their paper to be a well-reasoned paper all the way down to yielding a conclusion. Now that's going to feel rigid. It's not going to feel like an eloquent paper, but that's where rhetoric really comes in, and it helps students transition from getting their arguments to be valid and really strong and sound arguments into something that can be persuasive and beautiful and eloquent and have, adornment to it. But that's rhetoric's job. But at the core of it, it's got to be a valid argument. Not a true argument, but a valid argument. Ideally, we want it to be both true and valid, right? But it's not enough to just be true. We want this idea that logic is about truth and validity. That's how you get a sound argument, right? And so once again, sort of separating out these two notions, too often we find that students are content to just be right. They're not as concerned with the idea of whether or not their argument actually makes sense, right? And it's our job to force them into thinking more critically about themselves and holding themselves to a higher bar, so that they will create not just true points, but valid points, right? And that's where really going through the process of a deductive and teaching them how to think well and that their arguments need to be critical of themselves and not just of others. One of the things that I talk to parents about all the time is this idea that very often parents and teachers learn to sort of speak the language of their students, similarly to the way that maybe you have like a young toddler at your house or something, right? And you can understand what that kid is saying. You kind of translate for anybody that they come in contact with, because you kind of speak your kid's language, right? Very often with kids, whether it's in a homeschooling setting or at a school, teachers have been around those kids for so long that we kind of speak Joey, or we kind of speak Kimberly, right? Or we speak Ashton. We know what they're saying. We're like, okay, that makes, I know what they're saying. That's good enough. What we need to do though is be preparing them to be able to speak and be persuasive to people who don't speak Joey, right? And who are going to need to actually see Joey articulate himself, well, intentionally and strategically to get his point across. And so that's part of the job of the logic teacher, is to bring in that linguistic piece and marry it with the reasoning piece, so that we can get them to the point where they do speak with confidence, that they can be concise, that they use excellent vocabulary, that the words they say are chosen with intent and purpose. They're not settling for language, but they're really looking for the best and most articulate way to communicate. That's what good logic is all about. And again, all pointing them towards being able to create accurate statements, build valid arguments, and then ultimately be able to be persuasive and adorn them with eloquence and wisdom. So anyway, so this idea of needing to know where you're pointing the kids and what your goals and objectives are long term, right? Playing the long game with them. Even if you're only the teacher back at that 7th grade spot, you still want to be almost thinking in terms of, I'm preparing them for 12th grade. I'm preparing them for college. And so that's going to impact then how you actually operate in that 7th grade level class. And so that brings me to a question that I often get, which is, so who should take logic? Especially, let's be honest, especially things like fallacy detection, especially thinking in terms of finding the fallacies in commercials. It's a lot of fun, right? And you get, 5th graders who can probably do it with commercials, right? If you go through it, and they can memorize the vocabulary, right? They can memorize what does ad hominem mean, and they can, and it's fine, but it's a game at that stage. And I'm not in any way suggesting that education can't be fun. Don't get me wrong. I do think that there is something wonderful about the fact that kids can enjoy any subject at any time. But the question I often ask, and in fact, I just had someone email me yesterday with this, and so I had an opportunity to kind of put some thoughts together for her. My question for everybody is, what do you want the kids to be able to do with logic when they're finished with the class? And if the goal for you giving it to them isn't that they would be able to use and continue to use these skills largely independently throughout the rest of their middle school and high school career, then I think we've got the wrong goal in mind here. Yes, it's fun to be able to pick out fallacies in commercials that they see on TV, and I do use that as a tool to enhance my classes when I teach art of argument. But we have to remember that you are actually giving them a tool that they have to be able to use largely independently. And the sad truth is, the vast majority of our teachers in middle school and high school do not and have not taken a logic class. They haven't. And their ability to then help the students recall and apply logic skills throughout the rest of their middle school and high school program in history classes, literature classes, math classes, science classes, theology classes is going to be largely a void. Teachers will not be able to help them because we don't require most of our teachers to have taken a logic class. And that means that we are putting a huge weight of responsibility on the kids to carry and continue to use these tools on their own and with accuracy throughout the rest of their middle and high school careers, with very little input from their teachers. And so if the goal for them, and it's just kind of out of necessity, if the goal for them is that they are going to have to carry this largely on their own, then 5th grade is way too young. Even if they can memorize the content and the vocabulary, they're going to experience the course on a 5th grade level. That means that they're never going to be able to really convert that into adult logic at some point. An adult, because their experience of it is the one and only time that they're going to get it. It's going to be at a 5th grade level, which means you have to give them 5th grade level examples, right? Which means that they're even experiencing 5th grade level examples on a 5th grade level. We're really doing them a disservice. It would almost be like, having a 5th grader read, because they could string together the words and they could make sentences and maybe even comprehend. It would be like giving them, passages from, Augustine's Confessions, right? And saying, oh, good, we can check that box. Great news, they've read Augustine's Confessions. What are they going to do with Augustine's Confessions on a 5th grade level, right? How are they really going to internalize that? I mean, their spiritual development, their emotional development, their academic development, they are way too young to really plumb the depths of it and be able to do anything with it other than just check the box that and get the bragging rights of, well, my kid read Augustine's Confessions in 5th grade, right? And it's, wow, really? Yeah, they did. It's quite an accomplishment. We're all very proud, right? But what was the big goal, right? What do you want them to do with that? It's the same thing with logic. It's a tool. Now, that doesn't mean you can't expose them to some excerpts from Augustine's Confessions in 5th grade when it's appropriate to do so, when it enhances. It doesn't mean you can't, expose them to some logic and some fallacies from time to time in various places while they're, very excited about it. But largely, we want to give it to them at a chance when they're developmentally ready and when they're going to have the best chance to be able to carry that forward. And ideally, if you have any sway at your schools, try to make sure that all of your teachers are, getting some training in logic so that they can help reinforce this along the way. They don't have to be the ones that teach it, but they could still help to be reinforcers of it. That would really help with the process. But as far as development goes, I'm going to share with you what I said to this other woman who wrote in yesterday. This was what I shared with her. Developmentally, here are the characteristics I look for in a student who's prepared for the art of argument. They should still be excitable, but they know that they need challenge to the way that he or she thinks. Students and teachers should realize that when we use the word challenging or harder, we don't necessarily mean just more and harder or longer. Papers, for example, should be better reasoned, not just longer and more than last year. Students should be ready to have their thinking challenged, and teachers need to be ready to challenge students' thinking and push them to accurately express what they're thinking. Students who would be ready for the art of argument should like to be able to judge, critique, debate, and be critical. Students who should like to organize information and see patterns in information. Students want to know sort of the behind the scenes facts. They are curious about why for most things. And students think and act as if they know more than adults. Those are some of the qualities and characteristics that I see where students might be ready to take on the art of argument. Now, if you're seeing these characteristics, I would say it might be good to wait. Students are really, it's not, again, this first part isn't a bad thing. They're excited about new, interesting facts. That goes in either case, but here's the last one. They sort of exhibit with a childlike physical exuberance, right? Where, I mean, they are like antsy pants, right? They are just very childlike in the fact that their body evidences the excitement in a way of like, hugging the new thing and jumping up and down and that kind of thing. Developmentally, that means that they are just on that, they're still so childlike. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't adults who do that from time to time as well, but like as a pattern, a rule of thumb, this is something we want to kind of look at. Students want to always want to be relating their own experiences to a topic, just to tell a story. And they get lost in the analogies when they're told during a lesson, and they just really get easily sidetracked by rabbit trails. And it's kind of like, I didn't tell you the story because I wanted us to talk about the story. The story was supposed to be an illumination for something else. If they are just when you tell them a story, if they just keep riding right off that trail and now they are just in that other world and they can't understand the value of like figurative language to enhance a topic, then developmentally they might not be quite ready for art of argument. Students want to know the right answer, right? They want to know the what and the who and the where. But they really are get frustrated and bored when you try to get them to be like steadily digging into the why and the how of an issue. It's not important to them. Like they knew the right answer 15 minutes ago. Why are we making this harder than it needs to be? Let's just move on, right? They're not interested in the how. They're not interested in the why. They want to get on to the next what is what they want. If the student enjoys the task of organizing items, right? They love the idea of going school shopping because they like to organize everything and get their binder just so and everything, but they just don't have, they don't really love the idea of organizing the information that's supposed to go into those binders, right? When it's not both, that's also maybe a red flag. The students still really love chants and clever repetitious word sounds. Again, it's still fine if they do that, but they need to that needs not be the only thing that kind of gets them excited. And then this last one is one that I think is really important, that students that might need to wait, they enjoy memorization and they consider memorization learning. Okay, they consider memorization learning. Because we know that learning as you get older isn't just about compiling facts and being able to regurgitate on command. But when kids still think that memorization constitutes learning, and they're really not interested in a whole lot more other than that, right? I gave you the what, I gave you the where, I sang a little song. Like we've done this already. What's the next thing, right? That means they're not quite ready for art of argument. And that one's a little bit more nebulous, saying when students are ready for art of argument, because I do get that question a lot, because younger kids can do aspects of it. But should you be dedicating class? Should you really be checking that box and saying, okay, it's complete now, if you gave it to them in the 5th grade? And I would argue no. I'd argue that if you give them some, even with the art of argument in 5th grade, you probably want to do something else with it in the 7th or 8th grade again, because it's they're not going to be able to carry their 5th grade experience with them into a mature application of it when they get into high school or beyond at that point. So that's one of the things that I often talk about with art of argument. Discovery of deduction, people often want to know when I think it's time to start that formal side of logic. And again, I just want, and I don't want to be too redundant in case you were here with us last week, a couple weeks ago. But formal and informal, these words don't translate exactly the way that we use them in just everyday speech. Informal logic is not the t-shirt jeans version of logic, and formal logic is not the tuxedo version of logic. Okay, it's not that one is fancy, right, and one is just really chill and laid back. It does seem like informal would be it would be that way, but it's really not. Informal, it has a prefix in, meaning not. It means it does not have a form or a structure. Formal logic just means that this kind of logic does have a form or a structure. Right? So when we talk about formal logic, we are talking about the construction of an argument has to be in a particular form. We call that form a syllogism, right? And we call it propositional logic, and then it has a particular form with particular symbols that go along with it. It's not that it's harder, it's different. Right? It's less linguistic in that it has formal logic is less linguistic, meaning that we're not just looking for evidences of it in everyday language in the world around us, but we have to understand that formal logic informs, and it is the foundation for all that language that we see operating in the world around us all the time. And once students take the art of argument and the discovery of deduction, what they end up realizing, and hopefully teachers do too, is that the reason why there is an equivocation fallacy that we labeled in the art of argument is because there's actually the fallacy of 4 terms being committed on the formal side of an argument. The reason why we call it a sweeping generalization fallacy is because we've got universal and particular statements operating in the wrong way on the formal side, right? When you put the 2 sides of logic back together again, what you very often realize is that the evidences we see on the informal side, all of those informal fallacies, that there's actually a construction error on the formal side of the argument. And you can start to see more about the why when you learn about that formal side of the coin. And that's why we want to put them together and see them together. So they enhance each other. I talk about the way that a coin, when you take two sides of a coin and you fuse it together with heat, right, and the inside of the metal melts together, it gets melded together, and at a certain point you can't quite tell where the facing side of the coin stops and it turns into the tail side of the coin, because at a certain point it gets melded together, right, if you're putting two sides together. That's what happens with logic. They're mutually reinforcing the informal and the formal side together, and we have to understand that about it. So informal logic, I usually think in terms of who's prepared based off of developmental traits, including things like figurative language and excitement and student development, that kind of thing. With formal logic, we talk about the need to be able to suspend and hold separately the concepts of truth and validity. Again, it's not that we don't want arguments to be both true and sound together, but what we do want is for students to be able to critically analyze them differently and independent from each other. So students, and let's be honest, a lot of people are more concerned with just whether or not we're right? Is it true or is it false? And that's good enough. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a conference where somebody's come up to me and said, if I know the Bible's right, if I know that Christianity's true, why is it important that I learn logic? Why does that matter? And it's most important for everybody to realize that that we can't just be true, the foundation has to be correct as well, right? So, I mean, 1 Peter 3:15, he talks about always be ready to give a reason, right, for the hope that is within you. And he, basically always be ready to give an argument for the hope that is within you. But he goes on to say, do it with gentleness and respect. It's not enough just to be right. We have to be able to make sure that we provide a good argument and that then we deliver it with gentleness and respect as well. So for formal logic, I usually say that some of the good indicators, because we need to be able to reason in the abstract and hold these two ideas in suspension from one another, truth and validity, I usually say that students should have successfully completed a course in pre-algebra before they're ready to take formal logic. But I always try to underscore, it's not because there's any math, that you're not going to be using any equation-like principles. It's just, can students reason in the abstract? And if they've been able to progress through a solid course in pre-algebra and with success, that usually means that developmentally they're ready to reason in the abstract a little bit, and they can separate and hold these two concepts independent from one another just for a little while we work on constructing valid arguments, right? The kids who aren't quite ready for this, when you put them into a class like the discovery of deduction, if we're saying, okay, leave aside the truth for a minute, let's just look, and is there a valid argument here? These kids are the ones that have trouble being like, yeah, but it's wrong. It's like, I know it's wrong. I know that we don't agree with the conclusion, but is the argument valid? And they just can't even look at it. It's wrong. Like, why are we spending any more time on this? It's wrong. Right? Those kids aren't ready for the discovery of deduction, and usually those kids would not have been able to successfully complete a course in pre-algebra because they're just really not ready to hold in suspension that X can be more than one thing, right? In a pre-algebra problem, that you could actually go through and assign different values for X and get a different, and get numbers across a line, on a chart or a grid. That concept to them would be like, you lost me. Like, where are we now? Right? So pre-algebra is a good indicator of whether or not students are ready to take. Someone who successfully completed pre-algebra is usually a student who would be then ready to take a course in formal logic. Once we put those two things together, then students are ready for a wide range of different things. It could be the argument builder. so that they can really start building into, leaning into what is the invention process like, where they're really trying to find what it is what is true so that they can argue for what is true. Maybe they want to get into a debating club. Maybe they're ready to just jump right into rhetoric, with sort of skipping some of those other things. But once they have this complete foundation in logic, they can move in that direction. And then they could also then move into that more propositional side of logic as well, where they could maybe go towards the more mathematical, even leaning in towards programming a little bit if they wanted to go that direction as well. So that's a little bit about how I kind of, think about who's ready and maybe who's not ready. I think I've hit on most of the just overview pieces. Oh, one other thing, whenever you're going through, whether it's the logic, when you're thinking about rhetoric as being sort of your end goal, and you're going through rhetoric and logic together, and you're kind of doing that professional development for yourself so that you can have both a strong foundational base and you can know where you're pointing the kids. If you could start training yourself to think of it as opportunities to almost map how you learned the material as you go through it. Identify the places where the information that you're learning resonated with you, when you had your aha moment, where it made sense for the first time, where there was sort of that epiphany of, I see now how the square of opposition on the formal side actually tells me about these other fallacies I learned about in the art of argument. I get it now. Make sure you note some of those things. The students will probably have the same kinds of aha moments. And even if you're not the one who's doing the teaching at that time, when you're doing the front end teaching, you can be pointing them to and saying, now when you get to formal logic next year and you learn about the square of opposition, you're going to see and you're going to have this epiphany moment. I want you to come tell me about it when you do, because I wanted to tell somebody about it when I had it. And you'll see, but you can be like laying the excitement and the breadcrumbs out for what's about to come and where this is all going. So often students think that logic is sort of a means to an end to itself, and that there's, like it stays confined in its own little silo. And the more times that you can point it out, that where it has application points and all of the tentacles where it reaches outside of the logic textbooks, can build excitement for and show kids how to be using it. And that's really an exciting thing for kids to be able to see. It makes them feel like all of the work they're putting in is legitimate for something, right? They're not just checking a box because I'm in a classical school kind of thing. But there's a reason why we're doing it, and it makes good sense to do it, and it's going to help them. So anyway, that's something to just kind of think about as well. Well, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. There's always lots of questions. So Emily, you can toss them up to me whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I got kicked off earlier. I apologize I was in the middle of introducing you and I just got completely kicked out of the meeting. But let's see, we've had a few different, well, we had one question. Let me just throw to this one. And maybe we can do what we did at your last webinar and share the resources again at some point that you've mentioned. I've been sharing some links to Amazon for the rhetoric books that you've mentioned, but maybe we can go back over those a little bit later. But someone was just asking, you were talking about pre-algebra, and the question is, if someone has finished art of argument, is it right to assume that they may not be ready yet for discovery of deduction?
That would be true. So because the art of argument, it's not like a math class in that when you take pre-algebra, that then you're ready for, it has prepared you for algebra. The art of argument really is about inductive logic, and that's very tangible, and students can see it in the world around them, and they're ready for that before they're ready for formal logic. So you might, usually if you started about the 7th grade for art of argument, then most students are ready to just move right into formal logic. But if you start it earlier, for whatever your reasoning is, then developmentally they might not be ready for formal logic the very next year. So you do want to think through when you start so that it can feel cohesive for them as well. And that's another good reason to wait. to actually start a true logic program until the students would be ready to do one and then the next one.
Thanks. Another good question was, do you have recommendations for training teachers who are to be teaching logic? And I've shared Classical U as a resource. You all may have seen that on here. That is CAP's resource for training adults in classical pedagogy. So that has several different courses taught by Joelle. There's an informal logic class, a formal logic class. There's also classes on Socratic dialogue, discussion, that sort of thing. So Classical U is a great resource, but do you have anything else that you would recommend for getting teachers trained to teach logic?
That's a good question. So just a quick note about the formal logic course that's on Classical U. Sometimes there's been some misunderstanding about what that course does. So in that course, I do not teach the teacher the content. I teach the teacher how to teach the content to their students. So there have been a couple of teachers who have gone into it thinking like, okay, so she's just going to teach me how, and she'll be my teacher. That's not quite what it is. So there's an assumption there that you have at least kind of read through the discovery of deduction, and that you have you got at least a little bit of a grasp on what the content is. And you know what like the square of opposition is, for example. And then I give some pedagogical training and techniques for extension exercises, questions to consider, that kind of thing. So just know that about it. And then the informal logic one, that one as well is more extension work and less about teaching, here is what each one of the fallacies are. So because in both cases, they are not instructional, it is something that you would as a teacher, you would probably need to make sure that you've read through the material on your own. And then I would encourage you to connect with other teachers and kind of engage in some of that problem solving, fallacy detection. In my case, my husband, this is actually kind of funny, but when we got married, I was in the process of writing The Art of Argument. And he likes to joke that our entire marriage changed as a result of me writing that book, because I started to, I mean, I already knew logic, but I didn't live logic, right? It didn't like come out of my pores. But once I started writing the textbook, I started looking for examples, because I was looking for good examples to put in the book so we could, have exercises and things. And all of a sudden, everything changed for so my husband became a specimen, right? Like everything you're doing is a fallacy, right? And these are great examples, which he hated, by the way, but he very quickly learned logic himself, so that I wouldn't constantly beat him. So he said that logic, like me writing the book, changed our marriage. Anyway, but that's kind of what you need to do, is start looking for somebody else who can go through it with you and who can start living logic with you. We'll listen to podcasts now, we watch the news, we watch movies. I mean, there's fallacies in Horton Hears a Who, okay? The characters, I mean, when you start reading literature and you realize that the reason why characters get into the problems that they get into, and the reason why there's the crisis of conflict, is because there's usually some sort of miscommunication and fallacy-driven conflict going on. And you can't help yourself, you just start to see it. So the best teacher training, I say, is to get in community with other people who are studying it and who know it, and then try to find examples of it everywhere you can. Like, you're never off duty, you are always on fallacy detection. I think that's probably the best way to go at it. It'll change your relationships, and apologize to everybody, but it'll be fun too. As far as formal logic goes, that one really is more about, it's less about just interacting with it in the world around you. And it's also, it's a little bit more of a serious course of study. And you will need to commit to just spending some time and thinking about, can I take this argument that I'm hearing and can I put it into a syllogism, right? And then and making yourself practice interacting with arguments in this way. Thinking about how you would even help students take their outlines and turn them into syllogisms, so we can test them for validity, and walk them through that process. A lot of it is just, you kind of get out of it what you make space to get out of it, if that makes sense, I hope.
We had a good question earlier, which was sort of answered by some different people in the chat box, but a question about truth versus validity, you know, what is the difference there? Would you mind going back through like soundness, validity, truth, and just kind of defining some of those core logic terms?
So it's almost like a little equation. Truth plus validity equals sound argument, right? So if you have true premises, right, with a true conclusion, and that's usually where people stop. Like, I know that my two reasons are true and I know my conclusion is true, I'm good, I'm done. But really what we need to do is take those two premises, true premises and the true conclusion, and we need to figure out a way to actually construct our argument in a valid way. So there are 276 different ways to construct an argument. If you have two premises and a conclusion, there's 276 different combinations of ways that you can put your terms together and your premises and your conclusion together. 19 of those constructions are valid. Only 19, which means that you've got a lot of ways to screw it up. Right? And that's, I mean, so there's a lot of ways to have all the right information, but deliver it in a way that your construction is wrong, right? So the trick is to not ignore what's true, but to learn what these 19 valid types are, and learn the Aristotelian rules for testing a syllogism for validity, so that you can construct valid arguments and know what those valid arguments constructions are. Then you bring your true content in, you organize it in a valid way. Now you are guaranteed, and this is the beauty of formal logic. It's like plugging in numbers into a calculator. If you bring true premises and a true conclusion in a valid argument, you can pull a lever and you will have a sound argument. It's guaranteed that your argument will be sound, impenetrable, with certainty. Every time. Is that exception? I mean, that's the beauty of it. But if you just have truth and you don't worry at all about the validity of your construction, somebody then can go and chip away at the foundation of your argument. They can knock out one of the pegs that your argument is standing on, and now your argument is either crippled or it's just, it's completely obliterated and your point is lost, right? Because of faulty construction, right? I think of it in terms of like architecture. If you have if you build a glorious home, but you put it on a foundation that isn't going to stand up, it'll probably work for a while. Eventually though, it will be eroded, it will fall apart, and it won't matter how great the construction of the home is, the foundation is going to cripple the entire thing. It'll be unsafe. Right? And that's what validity is. Validity is the guarantee of a solid foundation that you're putting your argument on, and now you can move forward with confidence.
Thank you. And please feel free to continue dropping comments in the box. I think we have some time. We still have some time, right? For questions, but please feel free to drop more in the chat box if you have more that haven't been addressed yet. This would probably be a good time to go back over the resources, Joelle, that you mentioned earlier. Sure. So I dropped a few. If you've been in this session the whole time, then you should have access to the entire chat box. I'm gonna try to go back and just give you a list so that you don't have to scroll through all that, but you may have seen some of the Amazon links that I dropped in for example, the Rhetoric and Poetics of Aristotle. But I will just start dropping in some titles if you want to go back over some of the resources that you mentioned, especially for adults learning and kind of expanding their own understanding of logic.
Sure. So I'll start with Socratic Logic. This is a book by Peter Kraft. He's a logician. I think he works at Boston. I always get this wrong. Is it Boston College or Boston University? I forget. Anyway, this is a college level text. In fact, if you get the Discovery of Deduction and you get the teacher resource pack that has like the tests and quizzes and the extra worksheets in there, there's also in there what am I trying to say, like a schedule for going through the entire book in a year, to include some ideas for like an end of year project, or what have you. But there are, I went ahead when I created that and actually put a reference section that includes references to Peter Kreeft's book, so that when you're teaching a particular section from the discovery of deduction, that you can see where Kreeft addresses those same kinds of things in his book. His book and our book, as far as topically, they don't mesh just perfectly. But I sort of cross-referenced it for you, so that if you're going to be talking about the square of opposition in discovery of deduction, the resources there in Kreeft would be addressed at the same time. And I even have it scheduled so that, like 2 weeks before you would be getting to it in your actual class, I'm suggesting that you read through Kreeft's material. So I kind of give it to you so that you can be prepared, even as you're approaching the content in the discovery of deduction, that you will have been immersing yourself in what's coming next in Kreeft's book. So that could be a good resource for you. So this book would be the teacher's companion to help give you. You don't have to use it when you teach. I don't mean to suggest that, but if you want to make sure that you've got that nice, wide, and deep foundation for teaching discovery of deduction, I would recommend getting this book to help you prep for that discovery of deduction class. Now, I made that teacher training or that extra pamphlet, like I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, and I just recently got my hands on this book. So there's no mention of this one. This is Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking, the Skills of Reasoning and the Virtues of Inquiry by Ryan Byerly. This one I just recently came across, and so I've been working through it right now. There is a section in here on inductive logic as well. So same thing with Socratic logic with Peter Kreeft. He does, both of them address logic as a whole, both the art and the science. Both of them are heavier on the formal side of logic than the informal side of logic, for sure. But this would be another good foundational book. And like I said, what I really like about this one is it is including in here logic as a system of inquiry into truth, and that the virtues associated with going through inquiry, it's connecting those dots, if you will, which I know is often very important to instructors, especially to see where virtue gets connected in with process of inquiry. So those are the 2 logic books that I would recommend. The other, the rhetoric book that I didn't mention, that I mentioned that I don't have a copy of here at the house, is Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student by Edward Corbett. That is another college level text. I have taken high school students through that, but I have curated the experience for them very carefully as we go through that book together. I do think Rhetoric Alive, book 1, does a better job of meeting a 10th grade student right where they are, and there's you don't have to do any like translation, but it's a good resource if you're teaching Rhetoric 1 to have read Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student on that a little bit higher level, and then again that gives you a little bit wider berth from which to teach the Rhetoric Alive book. At some point, if you're going to be teaching rhetoric, or if you're going to be a student of logic, I would recommend picking up a copy of the Rhetoric by Aristotle, and just reading what he, just reading it from as a primary source, so that you can make sure that you've got that piece in your, it's foundational. Everybody else you're reading about is distilling Aristotle, and it's always important, if you're going to be a real student in the classics, to go back to the fountain, and Aristotle obviously is the fountain there for us. So that would be a good book to read as well. That one is also edited by Corbett. Edward Corbett. There's another book that is good for rhetoric. It's called The Office of Assertion, and I can't remember the author's name. The Office of Assertion. That is, it's like it's not a textbook per se. It's like a nice handy rhetoric manual. And I have seen some classical schools who aren't doing a formal rhetoric program. They will also often get that book into the hands of their rhetoric students for them to employ some techniques and things. I kind of feel like that's a little bit of a shortcut. It's like the tips and tricks of, good rhetoric, that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's nothing, but it's not a course for students to take. It's a good narrative to use, I think, as an accompanying resource for teachers or students. Is that helpful?
Yes. Oops, I think the link I just put in there got messed up because I was in the middle of typing something else about cap text, but we've got an author there, Critter, Scott Critter, for Office of Assertion. And then I was in the middle of typing them. Sorry, didn't mean to send that all at once. But the cap texts that have been mentioned are Art of Argument, Discovery of Deduction, Argument Builder, Rhetoric Alive. Those books have all been mentioned in this talk, and those books you can all find at classicalacademicpress.com. And there's actually quite a lot on the website. There are a lot of helpful links, descriptions of all the products, descriptions of how long the courses are supposed to be, things like that. And there are many of our resources have, if you click on support, there's a support tab under every single product. And the support tab will often have things like a suggested course schedule and things like that. So that may be helpful for some of you who are planning a course or trying to work in, that's been a question too, trying to work in logic to a humanities course or some kind of existing coursework at your school. Let's see. There was a good question.
While you're looking for it, if I could just say one other thing. I very often get teachers and parents, they email me and they'll say, I hear that, you always talk about, lifting logic outside of the textbooks and finding fallacies from all around you and everything. It would be great if you could just give me all of your examples. And, that would just save me so much time. And I just really appreciate that. Can you just send me the list and all the links and everything? And I got to say, it's the idea of like, give a man a fish, teach a man to fish kind of principle, right? I could just give it all to you, but then you're basically doing the same thing. And you, like, as soon as this, would you know how to identify what the fallacies are? Fallacies, when you look at an argument that has fallacies, it's rarely, if ever, is it just one. For example, I show my students this very short, I think it's like a 1.5-minute clip of a Matt Damon interview. And in that 1.5 minute clip, he probably commits 17 different fallacies. It's never just one. They're like cockroaches. If there's one, there's 100 of them, right? And I could give everybody that clip and say, here's a great clip, have at it. But if you don't know what the fallacies are and you can't pick it out of it, I would have to write the entire narrative exactly where, minute by minute in the video, of where the fallacies are. The point is for you to be engaging in the culture around you. The next time you're watching Horton Hears a Who, you figure out how the kangaroo is committing the, the fallacy of bifurcation and the ad baculum and the mob appeal, like all at the same time. You figure that out, and then you show the clip in your class, right? That's the point of logic, is that you start to show the kids that I just read something in the newspaper yesterday, or look at what so-and-so just said on the news last night, and you show it to them, and then they're going to be on the hunt for it themselves. But if it's just one more thing that came packaged in a box, the kids are going to be like, okay, well, somebody will tell me when they find one, right? And then, it defeats the purpose. You get excited about it, you go find them. Even if you're wrong, you're probably in the ballpark, but do it yourself. That's where the real excitement is, with finding good fallacies around. Sorry, go ahead, Emily.
Definitely. That's great. I was going to say too, a couple people have asked about a recording for this session, and yes, all of the sessions from this week are being recorded, and they will be available probably end of next week. So keep an eye out for an email that will go out with a link to all of the recordings. So there's no need to register for individual courses or anything like that. All of the sessions will just be available to you. So if you miss any of it, you'll be able to go back and watch. One question that Joanne asked is, what should rhetoric teachers know about logic to help their students bridge their learning? Which is a great question. And there's another one after that.
That's a great question. So rhetoric teachers really do need to know what a syllogism is, and they need to be able to employ syllogisms. They need to be able to dig into their rhetoric. The rhetoric teachers are going to be teaching about how to find good arguments, or find good reasons for good arguments. They're going to be help with the arrangement process. They're going to be helping with the rhetorical devices, and that's the style part of it. They're going to help with the delivery part of it, and if it's a speech, they'll help with the memory part of it. But none of that's going to matter if they haven't helped their students read into their paper and identify where they have committed fallacies or have faulty construction in their arguments. Because, you know, I mean, you can adorn anything to look wonderful. We call bad arguments that sound really good. That's where rhetoric gets its bad rap, right? That's why people are like, that's just rhetoric, right? It's because it's a really bad argument, but it's very persuasive and it's emotionally striking, and you know, it resonated with people, and people went off and did terrible, awful, no good, very bad things as a result of great rhetoric, right? Rhetoric becomes a tool for good when at its core, it's surrounded by arguments that are well reasoned, right? And then, which also have, and to be well reasoned, I would consider reasoning and logos, right, and ratio as all part of what we know to be true in the realm of wisdom, right? And so when I say it needs to be well reasoned, I also mean that it needs to be wise, right? And so part of offering rhetoric to a 10th grader and not to an 8th grader is, again, because we are really hoping that they're going to be leaning into wisdom and about how to apply the tools with truth, with reason, logic, right? Well reasoned with ratio, and you know, pulling together all of these things together in what we consider to be prudent, right? The virtues of prudence and justice, right? Fortitude and temperance, all of those kinds of things. But it all gets wrapped into, down at its core, is, did we use logic as the form of inquiry into what those things are, and then did we create a reasoned argument? So I don't think that any calculus teacher should be teaching calculus if they didn't first take arithmetic and algebra 2 and so forth, even though calculus doesn't really rely on algebra in its traditional sense, right? I don't think that we should be having rhetoric teachers teach rhetoric if they haven't learned logic either, because then they're just talking about, you know, the depth of it is only so deep. So it is, I think that there is a connection there, and the two really can't, you know, the grammar, the logic, the rhetoric all together forms the trivium, and we've got to see it that way and stop trying to silo these things into, that's lower school and this is middle school and then there's upper school. You know, it's all one thing. It's a river that flows together. It's just got different entry points on it. What is the next question?
Yeah, that's so great. The next one is, if a student has taken the art of argument during a time when you were talking about, like, maybe they weren't quite ready for it, you know, the ability to separate validity and truth and those kind of issues, if they're not sort of developmentally there yet, would it be better to start it over and do it again rather than move on to another course?
So asking if they should redo art of argument if they really weren't ready for it the first time?
Yes. Yeah. The question is, if a student has taken art of argument, but maybe it was too soon for them, would they benefit doing the same course again before moving on to something else?
So yes, but then you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to jazz it up a little bit, because I mean, if you just make them go through the exact same workbook again, I mean, you're just asking for kids to tune out. I mean, let's be honest. You would tune out as well. So you'll probably need to take the concepts of it and then lift it out with different, use it as a refresher point, with the definitions and maybe explanations, that kind of thing. But then the objective about the logic becomes different. Now we need to be giving them, more mature examples of, how to really engage with it. And so the objectives of the course become a little bit different. What I often find is that when it's younger, when people are doing it for younger kids, they often turn it into a 28-word vocabulary list, and then it becomes basically like a scavenger hunt, right, of pop culture to find fallacies. And just like anything, and I've used this example, actually I borrowed this example from Andrew Kern. He very often talks about when we're giving younger kids some of these more advanced tools, we basically teach them the skill in caricature, right? And so you think about this with a kid when you've got a very young child and they draw a picture for the first time of like a face, or, a person, they get all the dimensions wrong, right? You can probably tell that it's a human being, but only because you're really trying, right? Or, you know, when they become more advanced, we joked for a long time that when my daughter at a certain age, and she's 12 now, so she doesn't draw like this anymore, but when she was really little, she would draw a circle for a head, right? And then she'd put the eyes right up at the top of the up at the top. And my husband would joke that when he would draw her, she didn't leave any room for a brain. Like there's just, you know, it's just eyes up there, and then there's a nose and a mouth. Just kind of spread it out. You know, eventually you learn, right, as you get older, that your eyes are about almost a third of the way down on your head, right? And there's this other part up there, and you know, then you get the proportions right, and you know, you start to draw less and less, you know, in those big fat crayons in caricature. You start to actually draw, and your images become more realistic. And so if you gave them the caricature version of logic when they were young, then it's time to ask them to start doing, you know, the Rembrandt version of logic when they get a little bit older, right? And give them different opportunities with different tools, right? You're not going to give them the big fat crayons anymore, not just the commercials. You're going to put, you know, Thomas Aquinas in front of them this time, right? You're going to put Aristotle in front of them this time, and or Lewis, you're going to put C.S. Lewis in front of them and have them read Mere Christianity together, or whatever it might be. But you're going to, you know, advance what they're really kind of engaging with, and make sure that they can walk away with those tools and know how to do it for high school and beyond, instead of just as the fun thing they did in the 5th grade.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it, you know, maybe you could talk a bit about, I've seen a question or two in here about using logic and kind of working that into existing courses at a school, or somebody asked about sort of fitting logic in with a humanities course. I feel like it dovetails nicely onto what you were just talking about with, you know, maybe we don't have a course for every year. Maybe we have a year or two where there's sort of a gap or a little bit of space, and we can spend some time reading other materials, supplementing, and kind of continuing to build that into the students' minds, and train them how to think. But do you have any comments on how you would work a logic course into humanities?
Absolutely. So if you've got a staff, I mean, if a 7th grader can learn the art of argument and the fallacies, your staff can learn the 7 fallacies. I mean, the 28 fallacies. Now, I mean, would they be able to teach it, you know, all the time? Maybe not. But can everybody be familiar with it, so you're speaking the same vocabulary? That's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, if you've got a school where you're trying to do classical education, can you teach people the basics of a syllogism, and, you know, sort of distill for them when they're writing papers what that ought to look like, so that there can be some consistency across the platforms, across all the disciplines? Absolutely. Some things that that schools will do is, in those summer months, either at the end of the year, the beginning of the year, they will put their instructors together and give them those kinds of objectives, so that there are at least maybe 2 projects, one for the fall semester, one for the spring semester, where the kids have a project or a paper that's going to do double or triple duty, right? So that there's going to be something where, even if they maybe don't have the logic teacher that year, the logic teacher is going to get to contribute to the grade on that paper or that project for that, you know, at that one point. So that, you know, the logic teacher, who's really sort of your specialist, can be, you know, continuing to engage with the students as they progress through 8th, 9th, 10th, all the way up through 12th grade, perhaps, in different ways. Or, you know, if it happens to be the year that it's 7th grade when they're learning logic, then the logic teacher, the literature teacher, history teacher, whoever, then they're kind of progressing with the students about expectations throughout the course of the year as well, so that what kind of paper and what kind of conversations they're having at the beginning of the year are substantially different by the end of the year, right? And so there can be some of that coordination that goes on, but it has to be intentional. It won't just happen if everybody just stays in their silo. It's really got to be thinking about, how do we, if grammar, logic, and rhetoric are supposed to be the foundational pieces on which classical education and the entire trivium and the liberal arts come out of, then we have to be intentional about giving them their rightful space and time in every one of those stages. There's logic and rhetoric in the grammar level. There's grammar and rhetoric in the dialectic level, and there's grammar and logic in the rhetoric level, but all in different amounts and in different ways, and it manifests itself differently. But they're all present all the time. But we have to be intentional about how we're weaving them in, and that does take planning and a strategic plan from the head of school to make sure that everybody's working together in that way.
Thanks. Do we have any more questions for Joelle? I feel like we're kind of at the end of what, I'm sorry if I missed anyone. I'm pretty sure we've gone over all the questions that had come up earlier. So please feel free to drop anything in the box. We have a few more minutes before our session is up at the top of the hour. So feel free to drop anything in there if there's still something that you're
looking through that
you feel like has not been talked about. There's been a lot of, I've appreciated, I always like when people share their ideas and resources with each other. So there's been some nice chatter going on in our box over here. This might be a good thing. One person asked about the Rhetoric Alive, the thesis workbook. Would you just briefly talk about that, how that kind of connects? Because somebody had asked about the age range for Rhetoric Alive, which is about a 10th to 12th grade level. And then we have the senior thesis book. So would you briefly talk about that?
Sure. So Rhetoric Alive and the senior thesis book are books 1 and 3 in a series. I don't have the foggiest idea why we didn't publish books 1 and 2 and then 3, but that's above my pay grade. So right now it's books 1 and 3. Book 3 assumes that students have gone through and they know how to build now a good rhetorical argument, and that they have done so by going through something like Rhetoric Alive. What I tell students when I have taught them a Rhetoric 1 course is that when I get them in the 10th grade, the last time that somebody taught them how to write a paper was probably in the 3rd or 4th grade. And that by the time they've been practicing and they've been doing it since the 3rd or 4th grade. I mean, that's when they were taught how to write papers. Introductory paragraph, supporting paragraphs, conclusion, there you go. And by the time they get to me, most of them are really, really, really good at writing 3rd or 4th grade level papers. They write 3rd or 4th grade level papers like a champ, okay? But what they don't know how to do is write for adult writing. They don't know how to write in rhetorical writing. And what that means is that they have to blow away the fact that there are 5 paragraphs in a paper. We have to completely reimagine what writing a paper looks like. And what that means is that we need to come up with a narratio. We need to come up with a confirmation. We have to come up with a refutation. We have to do that repeatedly. There's all sorts, we have to employ logic and ethos and pathos into every single paper. There's all of these different pieces that go into it, and you are deconstructing the old way of writing and teaching them how to write again for the very first time with brand new criteria and expectations, right? Yes, we still use sentences, but gone are the days when you just need a good hook at the beginning and then that's all you need, right? It's because we are actually, there's going to be a metamorphosis, and we are going to teach them how to write good college level writing for the very first time. So Rhetoric 1 is about completely deconstructing, right? It's about saying that we are going through a complete redesign of the process, and now we are coming up with a brand new way of going through it. Everything from what do we start with, what are we going to write about? We're going to go through the invention process, which is completely different than pick a topic and now you can go research it, right? When your 6th grade teacher tells you to pick a topic and go research it, what they mean is pick the conclusion that you like and then go find all of the supporting reasons for why your conclusion is correct, right? And now go write a paper about it, right? It's a predetermined conclusion. The invention process says begin with inquiry. Actually see where the facts lead you, right? And figure out what the conclusion is based off of research. Don't go with the predetermined conclusion in mind. So everything from what are you going to write about all the way through to how you write it, what the entire delivery and the style and the arrangement is all wiped away. The senior thesis project is, okay, you've done that once. now, you know how to do it, right? And you've done it in little mini sections and you've practiced. Now you're going to do it in a more significant way that's going to constitute your sort of your senior thesis, right? And the expectations are going to be, elevated, and there's going to be a written component and there's going to be a delivery component as well, with the senior thesis. I have found that in some ways having the senior thesis book ready before book 2 is ready, it's kind of convenient because some people choose to do that in the junior year instead of the senior year. Senior year students are writing dozens, in some cases, of college entrance essays and doing a lot of extra writing all at the same time while trying to keep up with their normal coursework. So it's not an altogether bad idea to do your senior thesis as a junior thesis instead. Get a lot of that practice with Rhetoric 1, the thesis paper, and then when it comes to senior year and they're doing all those college entrance essays, that you're not trying to lump all of that in on top of a senior thesis as well. I mean, that's why we're seeing them, just crash so frequently in their senior year. So it's not an altogether bad idea to consider that in their junior year instead, especially while we're waiting for our second book to come out. So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Hopefully you all have gotten a good overview of sort of all of the curriculum resources that CAP has to offer for both middle and high school in logic and rhetoric. But again, please feel free to email us or call if you have any more questions. We will also have a couple of times where we have sales reps in our booth. You probably saw that on your conference information. Your teacher training week information, that there's several booth times open too, where you can just go chat with someone. That's a great opportunity to get questions answered, but you can always email us at info@classicalsubjects.com as well. Are there any, we've got somebody coming in right now. Again, just to remind you all, this session is being recorded, and so keep an eye out for that email that will go out likely at the end of next week with a link to all of the recorded sessions. Are there any parting comments to deliver before we wrap up today?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Good luck to everybody, Godspeed, and have a good time. Fallacy detection and logic is a lot of fun. At least I've enjoyed it. So I hope you enjoy your year as well. Let us know how it goes for you. We'd love to hear.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And please do get in touch if you have more questions. We really appreciate you all, and we hope you have a great rest of your week doing teacher training.
Bye, everyone.